Okay, here I am within Microsoft Visual Studio 2015. Fully updated, has the .NET Core SDK installed, as well as all the project templates that support .NET Core applications. So I'm going to come in here to File, New Project, and we can take a look at what project templates are available for .NET Core applications. And they're located in two different places. The first is under Visual C#. Under the Web folder here, you can see that there's an ASP.NET Web Application.NET Framework. That's not what we want. That uses the full .NET Framework using classic ASP.NET. But then notice that there's two different templates here for .NET Core, or ASP.NET Core. The difference between these two is that .NET Core is built on the .NET Core, and this is a template that builds an ASP.NET Core web application on top of the full .NET framework. I don't want to get too much into the difference between those two. Towards the end of the course, I'll talk more about this a little bit. But again, the difference is the foundation for your application. If you want to take advantage of all of the features of the .NET framework, and you're okay with deploying only to Windows, then you can deploy or you can build the application on the full .NET framework. Most of the time, however, you're going to want to use this template to build an ASP.NET Core web application on top of .NET Core. Okay, so those two templates are here within the Web folder. But notice that there's also a .NET Core folder here, which has three templates of its own. So the first is a class library. The second is a console application. So in essence, that's the kind of application that I've been looking at so far. But keep in mind that all of these really are console applications, which is how they get bootstrapped up. And then there's this ASP.NET Core web application, .NET Core. So this is the same template as the one back over here, that one right there. Okay? So there's two here, there's three here, but one's a duplicate. So altogether, you end up with four unique ASP.NET Core and .NET Core application templates. All right, so I'm going to create one of each of those four kinds of projects because that's going to let us explore some of the files and talk more about the structure of .NET Core applications. Okay, so the first one that I'll create is a class library. I'm going to put that in the Learn Now folder, and I'm going to call this Class Core. And click on OK. And it goes out and whirs and clicks and clanks and creates the project. I'm not going to use this tool, so I'll shut this down and don't need that. What I want to show you is Solution Explorer. Notice that it's restoring packages, and it's done, so it just appeared quickly. What happened there is that because this was a new project, .NET Core went out and did an automatic .NET restore in order to download all the appropriate packages. Notice that it happened fairly quick. I did yak a little bit before I opened Solution Explorer, but still it was only appearing for a couple seconds. So most of the packages that I need are already in the local package cache. But as I add additional packages to this project, then Visual Studio will take care of doing a restore to grab any new packages and their dependencies. So that's one of the nice things that Visual Studio does for us. Okay, and then otherwise, this project looks probably fairly familiar if you've built .NET framework applications. The only really big difference here, at least on the surface, is this project.json file. Okay, and you can see the contents of it there. Okay, so I'm going to start up another instance of Visual Studio 2015. And I'll go ahead and create a new project. And this time I'll create a console application. And I'll call this Console Core. And I'll create that. All right, so again, shut that down. And Solution Explorer, once again, it's restoring packages. And it has another set of files. Now, this is pretty similar to the class library, except that I have a program.cs file that has the main method, which is the entry point into pretty much all .NET applications. The class library project didn't have it because the entry point into a class library are the different public methods that are available that I define within that class library. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing again and create instances of the web applications, the ASP.NET Core web applications. Do File New one more time. And this time I'll go ahead and move over to the web folder here. Again, I don't want this one because this is not ASP.NET Core. This is the classic ASP.NET. So here's the ASP.NET Core web application built on .NET Core. And I'm going to call this WebNet Core. And create that. Okay, so now this project template, just like the project templates in classic ASP.NET, throw up this additional dialog box. In this case, I'm just going to create an empty project. So this is the minimal kind of a project. But I could also create a web API and a web application. Now, keep in mind that in ASP.NET Core, these are a lot more similar than they are in classic ASP.NET. Again, that's because there's two different controller base objects that you use. If you're creating web services, you use one. If you're creating a web application using ASP.NET MVC, you use the other base object. But those objects, those controller objects, are now combined into one. But in this case, I'm just going to create an empty project because I want the minimal files for an ASP.NET Core application. All right, I don't want to create an app service in the cloud, so I'll cancel out of that. And once again, I'll close that and hide that. All right, because this is a web application, I get a lot more files, a lot more things going on here. So notice that it's restoring the packages, but I have a different structure here. I have some additional files. Notice I have a web.config file, I have a startup.cs file, and this project readme.html that has all kinds of information. What's a little bit annoying here is that this is an empty project template. So theoretically, it's empty of everything but what's absolutely required. Well, I guess the developers at Microsoft just couldn't resist putting in stuff that they think would be useful. The first time you create a project like this, sure, explore these links, lots of great information, lots of really good information, and so forth. But frankly, after you've created your 50th project, this gets a little bit old. So I'm going to shut this down, and I'm going to go ahead and delete it from the project. And yes, please delete it permanently. Okay, so that's the other project, and we'll be looking at the different parts of this program structure shortly. But first, I want to create the fourth and final project type. So I'll start up a new instance of Visual Studio. Do a File, New Project. And now create a project, an ASP.NET Core web project that is built on the .NET framework. And this one I'm going to call Web Full Frame for the full framework. Okay, I once again get this dialog box, and I'll again select the empty template. Now, the thing that I forgot to do in the previous project that I created was uncheck this dialog box. That's why we got that additional dialog box that prompted for connection information for Microsoft Azure, or Azure, depending on how you pronounce it. So this time I remember to uncheck that, and we shouldn't get that dialog box. And it goes ahead and directly creates the project. Okay, we once again get that README file. Okay, it's not quite ready. If I come over to Solution Explorer, it's still restoring packages. And I'll go ahead and delete that file again. Okay, come back over here. Come on. Shut that down and unpin that. Okay, so then we have a slightly different project structure here for this ASP.NET Core web application that's based on the full framework. Now we're going to look at each of those projects that I just created in a little bit more detail. But first I want to talk about all of the different core set of files that the projects create. And so in this table it lists all of the files that are involved in each of those 4 project types that I just created using the .NET Core project templates that are provided by Visual Studio. Okay, so we have the class library, and as you can see, that and the console application have an assembly info.cs. There's an app.config with the web application with the full .NET framework. That kind of makes sense because classic ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core applications that are built on the full framework use .config files in order to make various settings, including the web.config file, which you can see at the bottom there. And surprisingly, the web application, the ASP.NET Web Core application file uses web.config as well, and I'll explain why in just a moment. Okay, so the class library has a class1.cs. That makes sense because it's providing the basic class file, which you'd want to rename. There's a global.json file in every one of them. There's a launch settings.json file, and we'll take a look at the JSON that's included in that, but that applies to web applications. Then there's a program.cs, and that makes sense because we have to have an entry point for everything but a class library. So class library, again, the entry points into it are the public methods that you define on that class. We have a project.json file, and that is in all 4 of the projects, but it's something that in future versions of .NET Core is going to be modified, and I'll talk about that when we look more at the structure of that file. Early in the course, I talked about the project.lock.json file. That's essentially a file that is created when you do a .NET restore in order to make the restore using NuGet more efficient. It doesn't have to repeat work that it's already done. And so that applies to all 4 of the projects. And then the remaining files apply just to the web applications. Project.readme, that annoying yet helpful file. Then there's an xproj and an xproj user. Those are essentially replacements for the csproj and the vsproj files, but we'll take a look at those and talk more about what those are, because those are involved in the changes coming to project.json. Startup.cs is the standard file name that Microsoft uses for all of the code that you use in order to wire up all of the middleware for a web application. And that applies to all ASP.NET Core applications, whether they're based on .NET Core or on the full framework. And then, as I mentioned, web.config is part of both types of web applications. Now also notice that a couple of the files are not visible in Solution Explorer, and those are the xproj files. And that's because within Solution Explorer, those are essentially, you can think of them as configuration files for the projects. So, but all of the other files appear within Solution Explorer, and you have access to them directly. Okay, so now let's take a closer look at the structure of those projects that I created and these standard files. All right, let's talk more about each of these different project types and those project files. The first one that I want to talk about is app.config. Now this project that I have open is the full framework version of the ASP.NET Core application. So again, this is using ASP.NET Core on top of the full traditional mature .NET framework. Now app.config is, well, it harkens back to the .config files of older applications. It's an optional configuration file, similar to the app.config, various kinds of configuration files that different full .NET Framework application used. And it's been in use since .NET Framework 1.0. The code in this default file identifies whether to use server-based garbage collection or client workstation type garbage collection. The file is only part of an ASP.NET Core application that is built on top of the full .NET Framework. So it's really kind of a link from the new back to the old. Okay, so you can, as you're going to see, some of these files are, particularly this and web.config, allow you to hook into some of the older features of the .NET Framework. Okay, going in more or less alphabetical order, the next one I want to talk about is the assemblyinfo.cs file. And you'll find that under the Properties folder here. And if you've done any kind of work with the .NET Framework over time, this file will look familiar. This file identifies assembly data, such as configuration, company, product, trade, and trademark information. This is the standard assemblyinfo.cs file that's been part of Visual Studio .NET projects since .NET was first released back, well, near the turn of the millennium. Basically, it's really just a collection of assembly attributes with information that is baked into the assembly when you compile it. And again, this is only going to apply to the non-web projects. Okay, then next up is in the class library is this class1.cs. Nothing particularly special here. It's just a skeleton C# file for the class1 class and includes its default constructor there. And obviously when you create a new class library, you'd immediately rename this file and rename the class and the namespace and so forth. So again, if you've done any kind of .NET programming, this is just a class. It has methods, properties, and whatever else that you want to do with it. Okay, then next up is the global.json file, and this is in all four of the project types. Now, this is generated automatically as long as you have selected the Create a Directory for your solution when creating the first .NET Core project. So as I'll talk about later, the Projects node identifies additional locations for source code when debugging. It's going to be fairly rare that you'll need to directly deal with this file, but there are certainly certain situations. Okay, then the next file I want to talk about is coming over to the ASP.NET Core on top of the .NET Core application, although this file is also in the web application built on the full .NET Framework, is again in the Properties node here, and it's called launchsettings.json. This identifies the various web hosting configuration settings, including an application URL for debugging, an IIS host such as IIS Express, if any. You can also set environmental variables to set before launching the application. These can be used, for example, by the .NET Core configuration to identify the environment, development, test, or production. And then you can also have SSL and authentication settings here within this launchsettings.json file. Changes made from the Debug tab on a Project Properties window of Visual Studio. If I right-click here on the project and go to Properties and the Debug tab here, here is the nice GUI interface where you can set most of the settings within the launchsettings.json file. Okay, so if you go back and forth, you can find the different names of various things about whether to enable SSL, anonymous authentication, environmental variables, and so forth. So there's that environmental variable. Okay, then a big file, an important file, is this project.json. And as you can see, this is a fairly, well, it's got several different sections. And in a real full-featured ASP.NET Core application, this is likely to have a lot of information in it. And in fact, this is something that you're probably going to modify a fair amount as you add features and build an application. So this is a new file, and this functionality overlaps in large part with that of the former CS proj file. So what project.json does is identifies things such as project references, build options like the version number, and identifies the platform to compile to, whether it's .NET Core or the .NET Framework, for example. A big part of the role of this file is to let you change and maintain the NuGet packages used by the application. Okay, so this is the one for the ASP.NET Core on the .NET Core Framework. And I can also go to the one that's built on the full .NET Framework, and you can see some basic differences. So there's various dependencies, tools, frameworks here identifies the .NET Framework 4.5.2. If I come back over here, you can see that I'm using .NET 5.6. That's a little bit misleading, but this is the .NET Core framework, and so forth. And so there's various settings that are specific to that particular project type, including the dependencies that are required. Okay, another file that I talked about a little bit in an earlier part of the course is this project.lock.json file. So this is in all of the projects again, and it stores a list of the files, usually NuGet references, that are needed for compilation. It includes things like specific package version numbers, which is unlike the project.json file, which supports wildcards. So you can use wildcards in project.json, and that will use essentially the latest version of, and this doesn't have any, but I could use version 1.0 point asterisk, and it'll use the latest available released version of version 1.0 of the .NET Core framework. But project.lock.json actually uses fixed version numbers. Okay, so the whole point of the project.lock.json file is to prevent an entire restore of packages every time you compile the project, which could take a lot of time and is a lot of duplicated work. And so the lock file includes a package graph along with other data related to packages that have been downloaded locally, which you do when you execute the .NET restore command. For the most part, you shouldn't check this file into source control. In fact, I'll say more strongly, don't check this file into source control. When it doesn't exist locally, it's recreated by running a NuGet package restore, which Visual Studio, for the most part, handles for you. And in earlier parts of the course, you saw me do it manually using a .NET restore. Okay, then the next file I want to talk about briefly is this program.cs. And actually, I'm going to go over to the console application and show it there first. And as you can see, this is a very simple file. It defines the entry point into this console application. It's just a program class and a main method that is the standard input or entry point into the application. But what's interesting is that this file exists in the web applications as well. But what happens within this file is highly dependent on the type of application. In a typical console application, you don't need to do much here. You just run whatever program you're going to, or whatever code that you're going to run. Now, in a class application, notice that there isn't a program.cs file because a class library doesn't have a specific entry point. Again, entry points are the public methods that you define within the application. But then if I come over here to the ASP.NET Core application and look at program.cs, you can see that what this is doing is it's newing up this web host builder. And this is including most of the features. I didn't use IIS integration, but it's most of the features of the application that I built from scratch earlier in the course. So you can kind of see how this all comes together. Now, I created this project from the empty template, if you'll recall. So that's why it has this basic framework code, not all of which is necessarily required, but in order to implement this class completely, you would have to expand on that and customize it. One thing to keep in mind is that you need the startup class. Nothing magical about the name startup, but it's what Microsoft uses by convention, so it's probably easier if you stick to that convention. And that's in this separate file here. And I'll talk about that more a little bit later in the course. Okay, so I'm still in the ASP.NET Core application that's built for using the .NET Core framework, and we have good old web.config. Again, if you've done web development going back to the earliest days of ASP.NET, this is going to be a familiar file to you. So maybe a little bit surprised to find it here, because basically ASP.NET Core doesn't use .config files. In fact, .NET Core applications don't use config files in order to perform its configuration. It's all now in project.json. Okay, so the file is still with us, despite, by the way, it going missing in action in pre-release versions of ASP.NET Core. For a long time, as Microsoft was building what became .NET Core, the releases didn't include, for ASP.NET Core, didn't include web.config. But it's back. And the reason is that it provides a minimal configuration for IIS, instructing it where to find the web host process and configuring that all traffic is redirected to that process. So it's a way of integrating or running this application on IIS if you're running it on Windows. Okay, now one thing to notice about this is, first of all, it's a pretty simple file. Over the years, with different versions of the framework and different migrations and so forth, this file has grown and shrunk, particularly as different settings are in machine.config and other configuration files. But this pretty much stands on its own, but it doesn't contain app settings. Instead, those app settings are moved into configuration files that are loaded by Microsoft.extensions.configuration. Most notably, that's going to be project.json, but you can also create your own JSON-based configuration files as well. And so that's where you're going to want to put the configuration files. And in fact, some of the GUI elements of Visual Studio, as you're working with a project, take care of essentially editing JSON files behind the scenes. Okay, then the last couple files I want to talk about aren't exposed within Solution Explorer. So I'm going to come over here to Windows Explorer, and here's the WebNet Core project directory. Again, this is the project that I created to use ASP.NET Core that runs on the .NET Core framework. So if I drill down into that, notice that there's a source directory and a web.core, and then there's these two xproj files. Okay, so if I right-click on that, and I'll open that up in code. It's as good a text editor as any. Close that file, or the Explorer. Try to anyway. There we go. Okay, so what this file is it's an MS build file that, out of the box, defines what will happen when you build the project. The latest version imports Microsoft.net.targets, which defines build tasks that leverage the new .net.exe command. Unlike MS Build project files in the past, xproj files are surprisingly small because much of the information has moved for the moment into project.json, and I'll be talking about that. Okay, so for the most part, you're not going to need to edit this file. And then the other one that I want to point out is this xproj.user, which I'll also open up in code. All right, there we go. So what this file does is it overrides the xproj file and provides additional MS Build properties, things such as local user debug specific settings like ports. Generally, you don't want to check this file into source control because it's user specific and it's not visible from within Visual Studio. Okay, so don't worry about those files for the most part. Just be aware that they're there and they do have some settings. There might be some esoteric situations where you need to deal with those files, but, well, in the current state of .NET Core, you won't need to, but in future versions of .NET Core and ASP.NET Core, you may need to. Okay, now let me come back over to Windows Explorer here and go back up. And I mentioned in passing this src folder. With all of the .NET Core project types that I create using Visual Studio, if I select the Create a Directory for your solution, that option within Visual Studio, when I create a new project, it places all of the source code into an SRC subdirectory for the solution. And in addition, it's expected that test projects will be placed in a test directory alongside SRC, a sibling directory right here. I didn't create a test project, so there isn't any. Now, because it also doesn't happen by default in the current version of the .NET Core tooling. Okay, and then other possible directories you might want to consider using would be for things like builds and docs. So just keep in mind that if that option is checked, you're going to have an SRC folder, and that's going to have all of your code for the application. So this is the actual program structure right there. Okay, and then there's also this www.root. Let me go back over to my WebNet Core project, and you can see this www.root folder there. And that relates to a physical folder on the disk. This is where you should put all your public static content for the web application. So this just applies to web applications. And that includes CSS, JavaScript, and image files, any kind of static content. And this is the default, but you can change the location using the web host builder object. That's that object that you build up in the main method in the console application that loads up and creates the web server. Okay, so that's a whirlwind tour of some of the more important common files that you're going to encounter in .NET Core applications. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about project.json. And again, this is the one in the WebNet Core, the ASP.NET Core that's designed to run on top of the .NET Core framework. So this is probably the most significant new file in the .NET Core project structure. So the file is designed to do, well, really three main things, but it has a lot of functions. First of all, it replaces the NuGet file manager package.config file that, again, if you're an existing .NET developer, you're probably familiar with. Because what that file does is identifies the NuGet references for the project. And for the most part, that's probably been managed in Visual Studio for you. You can edit it directly and add packages, but now you're going to be working with project.json. The second function of the project.json file is to specify which frameworks the project supports and configuration details for how to build the project for the specific framework. Okay, and you can see that here, and this is configured to use the .NET Core framework. And then the third primary function of project.json is to identify the target platform for self-contained apps, which contain all their dependencies, including the platform-specific .NET Core runtimes needed for that platform. Okay, but in general, it's going to include a lot of different options. In fact, here's the build options. You might remember earlier in the course, I manually added to the project I created using .NET New, I had to add this item when I changed the application into an ASP.NET MVC application. Okay, so those three primary tasks are spread across four main sections within project.json. There are also other possible sections, which depends on the project type. Two that I specifically want to call out here are dependencies and frameworks. So the first one is dependencies. This section needs to list each of the NuGet packages on which the project depends, including the version number of those dependencies. Now, version numbers, as I mentioned, can be specified with wildcards so that you can allow the most recent version that matches the wildcard to be downloaded automatically by the NuGet Package Manager Restore. A pair of empty quotes, if I didn't include a version number in here, says just use the latest version available. And then, while you can add references via the Visual Studio NuGet Package Manager window, just like for Visual Studio now and prior to .NET Framework, you can also rely on the way Visual Studio asynchronously loads IntelliSense with the packages available from your configured package source or feed. And by default, that's Microsoft's NuGet feed. So what's cool is that IntelliSense works for both the package name and the version number. So if I come down here and look to add another item, notice that I get IntelliSense. I can type in Microsoft, do that, and then dot, and it gives me a list of various packages. I can do ASP.NET Core, and let's say I want to use cores. Okay, and then it sees that that's complete, and it gives me IntelliSense for all of the versions that are available as well. So I can select 5.0 and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to undo all that. Okay, so getting that IntelliSense is really pretty nice. It's a nice way to not necessarily discover the different packages that are available, because you really don't get much information about what they are. But you can find the name if you don't quite remember what the name is. It saves some keystrokes, and then it also shows you what versions are available. So it really can be a time saver when you're looking to add new packages to an application. Okay, and then the other main section, I just want to point out, is frameworks. In this section, this is where you identify the frameworks on which the project is going to run. Common ones include Net 4.5, Net Standard 1.5, Net 4.0. Those are just a few of the examples. In addition, you can provide build options, dependencies, framework assemblies, and imports, apps specific to the identified framework. So essentially what you're doing is you can configure how each of the frameworks is used. Okay, so you'll definitely want to be familiar with project.json. Look at how it's configured in each of the .NET Core project templates when you create it, in order to learn what's relevant and then investigate the different parts of it. But, okay, big but. Although project.json is critical within, well, actually within the RC1 and RC2 pre-release versions, as well as in the release version and all of the minor upgrades released so far, not long after Microsoft released RC2, the teams at Microsoft really determined that project.json was in fact redundant to the already well-established mature MS Build project file. That build file already supports significantly more functionality, including configuration, build dependencies, build targets, compilation flags, command line and environment variable property settings, as well as the build commands itself. This is where you could automate what happens when you build this application. So they're starting to think that rather than reinvent all this, the team reviewed what triggered the project.json file, why they felt they had to create that separate configuration file and put it in the JSON format. And they realized that the project files, the MS Build files previously, were very bloated, doing things like listing every file within a project individually, rather than using wildcard patterns. So there's a lot of other stuff within those old build files. That bloat is so significant that really developers rarely open and review the file before running a build, even though potentially the file could have some undesirable commands embedded within it, because Visual Studio and the project template takes care of a lot of the steps of doing all that. Okay, so what Microsoft is thinking now is that rather than creating an entirely new build file, even though it's part of the released version of .NET Core, they're going to fix the bloat within the proj files and even provide a command line utility for editing it. The only thing that project.json has that the proj files don't is the JSON syntax. But after all, JSON is really just today's XML. Just like XML was in its day the modern day flat file or ini file. Okay, so there's actually a blog post that is pretty interesting about this. I don't know the person who wrote this, but it's a follow-up on the ASP.NET community stand-up. And by the way, that's Damian Edwards, who is one of the project managers, that higher up project managers for the entire .NET Core project. So he's with Microsoft. And if you're not familiar with the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up, and if you're a web developer, you might want to go start listening to it, assuming it's still going, but they have the archives online as well. And so this is part of what they covered on May 10th, 2016. So actually before they released the initial version of .NET Core, or I guess that was around the time of the initial release, they already started thinking that this was a mistake. And so in that particular episode, they talked about what the problems were and why they went to project.json and why they're thinking about going to the build file. Okay, so if you're interested in that, you might want to read that and investigate some of the links and probably watch that community stand-up. It's something that they're currently doing every Tuesday, and hopefully they'll continue doing it. It's a little annoying because it's taped live, and so usually there's a lot of personal back and forth going on at the start of it. Sometimes they start a little bit late, and they have different feeds. It's done on Google Hangout, but they watch Twitter for questions, and they answer live questions and so forth. But finally, they always get going, and it usually involves Damian Edwards and Scott Hanselman, and I think it's John Galloway. And so really good information, people that are deeply involved at Microsoft with .NET Build. So that's where this blog post came from, was that community stand-up. And here's the web page for that. It's live.asp.net, where you can go to get those. And you can scroll down and see all the past episodes. Okay, so really nice resource that Microsoft makes available. Okay, and then one other thing that I want to point out is about debugging in .NET Core and Visual Studio 2015, because this is one of the features that I'm really pretty excited about, because there's new support for debugging and stepping into packages and even modifying the source code of the packages if it's available. So for example, say that you have some sort of a framework assembly that you've created in-house in some enterprise and it's shared amongst a bunch of teams. But the framework package is essentially open source so that anyone within the company can contribute improvements and changes. And of course, this can apply to public open sources as well. Now, if you reference the NuGet package for that framework that you've developed, but at some point find that there's a bug that still needs fixing, or you need to add a feature, so it's that kind of scenario. Normally, this would require working with the source code from the component independently of your project or solution. But instead, with these new features, what you can do is download the source code and update it as an integrated, essentially code alongside your main development, even stepping into the code without relying on a symbol server or the PDF files. And that's a key scenario that is enabled with .NET Core and Visual Studio 2015. Okay, so this isn't something that I'm going to go into in any more detail. I just wanted to point it out. There is this nice blog post. It is one of the older ones. It references ASP.NET 5, but it does talk about the debugging tools. And this is, at the moment, the best source that I've found for this. So it's probably worth checking out this particular post. And then when you're starting to learn all this stuff, go out and learn, see if there's more. I don't recall that there's anything on the documentation site on .NET, that site that I showed you earlier in the course, but hopefully at some point there will be, or maybe it'll be part of the Visual Studio documentation.